皆さんこんばんは。We're gonna start our presentation about modality in Japan, and our group is me, Joyce, Andy, and Jesse. So our first slide to introduce you to the idea of modality is modality no imi wa nan desu ka? So modality is a linguistic term that describes expressing degrees of certainty, desire, judgments, volition, obligation, and other related concepts. So we've started to learn some of this in previous grammar lessons, but we're going to go deeper into these concepts. First of all, there are types of modality, and each type of modality can be expressed in different strengths. And modality is used to convey the degree of a speaker's conviction concerning certain factual truths or possible situations while considering the listener's feelings and attitudes. So modality is a universal concept, but in Japanese culture, it's rather important because of how society is built. So our second slide, 日本人はなぜ modality を使いますか? Why do Japanese people use modality? So in Japanese culture, Japan is a very feudal society, and there's a strict social hierarchy that can be seen in general society among friends, but also in a workplace. And there are very specific rules for politeness and respect. And these rules still continue to have varying degrees today. And Japanese culture and living in close quarters stresses the importance of wa, which is group harmony. And then there's a need to maintain wa, and also appropriately communicating hon and tatemae, which is what we presented many, many moons ago. And balancing hon and tatemae allows everyone to communicate properly, yet preserve men honkoku, which is kind of face. I guess we call that in Asian culture, honor, reputation. And the use of modality by the speaker and understanding of modality by the listener is pretty necessary to effectively participate in Japanese culture. And just to stress, as you all know, Japanese culture is very homogenous, and there's a lot of pressure to behave a specific way, and that's why modality is so important. And now we can move on to explaining different types of modality. So the first type is epistemic modality, and under this umbrella, you can find factual probability, reasoning, and beliefs. So examples in English are words like might, could, would, will, looks like, seems like, probably, likely, certainly. And then there's also Deontic Modality, which houses rules, obligations, ability, and desires. And examples in English include must, should, have to, shouldn't, don't, need to, allowed, forbidden, and so on. In Japanese culture, there's a lot of focus on obligations, duties, and responsibilities. Duties and responsibilities in Japanese is gimu. Sensei can correct my pronunciation if it's wrong. But because of that, Japanese people have relatively more words and grammar constructions to communicate ideas related to societal obligations as compared to English. But English also seems to have more words that describe factual probability, reasoning, personal beliefs. And then within these types of modalities, there's also strength. So there's high, low, and high, but in a negative perspective. So will indicate something's probably going to happen. Probably it might means there's a chance, and unlikely means there's a less chance, and then won't at all means it's not going to happen at all. So example is will rain, will probably rain, might rain, unlikely to rain, won't rain at all. On a similar note, on the other side, there's also you must do something, you should do something, you could do it, shouldn't, and never do it.
はい、ありがとうございます、ジョイさん。
Hi, konbanwa. Watashi wa Andy desu. I'll be explaining for the epistemic and deontic modality. For the first example, we have, excuse me, we have a lot of people will probably be at the next week's meeting, which is Raishu no kaigi wa hito ga oi desho. As opposed to changing the desho to des, that would remove all the uncertainty. So it would become Raishu no kaigi wa hito ga oi desu. Basically adding certainty. So a lot of people will be at next week's meeting. For the second example, amai keiki ga amari suki janai desu. For this example, adding the n, it gives more emphasis to the statement. So thus being a stronger form of modality. And depending on the situation, it can also sound like a complaint or whining, as opposed to just having janai desu versus janain desu. Next slide. For the next slide, we have atarashi keitai wa motto yaku ni tatsu to omotte imasu. I think a new cell phone will be more useful. And for this example, if we remove the omotteimasu, we can form a more direct response. So it would be motto yaku ni tachimasu. A new phone is more useful, thus becoming a more objective statement. For the next example, sono kaban wa takai kara hinshitsu ga yoi desho. For this example, there's new vocab, hinshitsu, which means quality of a product or service. And the sentence being, that bag is expensive, so it'll probably be of good quality. Again, versus removing the desho for des, it would be the bag is expensive, so it is or must be of good quality. Sono kaban wa takai kara hinshitsu ga ii desu. Next slide. For this example, we have Shumatsu wa hima desu kara Shibuya ni iku kamo shiremasen. For kamo shiremasen, it means may, might, or perhaps. So this sentence would mean I might go to Shibuya next week because I'm free. Versus just having it as a Shumatsu wa hima desu kara Shibuya ni ikimasu. I'll go to Shibuya next week because I'm free. For the rain example, Kyou wa ame ga furisou desu. There's kind of like 3 different ways we can have this modality. Having furisou desu, or futteimasu, it's raining, or ame ga furimasu, it will rain today. And it's all different forms of modality, epistemic modality. Next slide. And for this one, we have the examples of Deontic modality. And as Joyce explained, Deontic focuses on rules, obligations, abilities, and desires. So for the first one, we have sono ki no shito de, or shita de, chotto yasumimashou ka? Shall we take a little rest under that tree? And here we have 3 different forms like masen ka, mashou ka, and mashou. So masen ka would sound like more like a question that respects the listener's wishes. Mashou ka, it sounds like a suggestion that respects the listener, but less than the previous example. And just mashou without the ka, it sounds like a direct suggestion. So it's it's less considerate of the listener's feeling. It's like saying, let's go do this. So again, it's like varying forms and strengths of a modality. Excuse me. For the next example, we have oi pen de namae o kaite mo ii desu, which is basically you may write your name in blue pen, or it's okay to write your name in blue pen. So in this case, we're giving permission. Versus if we were to say kaite wa ikemasen, we would basically say like don't write your name in blue pen. Versus another form of kakana kakana kereba narimasen, it would be basically you must write your name in pen or in blue pen. Again, just all varying levels of modality, like strength, and in certain respects, like different varying levels of respect. For the next one, hon o kaisa nakereba narimasen, I must return this book, versus hon o kaeshite kudasai, like please return this book. Again, it's all different forms, or like stronger emphasis. Sometimes some forms have like negative feelings, and certain forms like communicate a must. Hi, next slide. And for the last slide, for the first two examples, we learned them from Mina no Nihongo, the first book. Koko de tabako sutte wa ikemasen. You can't smoke here. For the next one, we have kodomo wa harawa nakute mo ii desu. Kids need not pay. And basically, for the last one, we have where's my notes? Furui o tera o mitai nara Kyoto e ittara ii desu. So basically, if you want to see old temples, you should go to Kyoto. Basically, in Japanese culture, to not seem as abrupt, we often express ourselves in connection to e, or as in good. So, so it reinforces cultural norms to follow like obligations, social convention, and so on.
ありがとうございます。ヤニさん。これからジェシーです。I'm going to talk about a couple more examples of Deontic modality. So we have the suggestion, 彼女を紹介していただけませんか? Won't you, and that's a very kind of polite way to ask. You can change that rather than using a negative question like いただけませんか? You can just say いただけますか? And a lot of times, especially more polite modalities, will use the negative form and as a question to soften that up, give space for the listener to feel okay to say no. They don't usually say no, but it makes them feel better about that request. There is also, again, lots of ways that Japanese speakers can express gimu, and obligation forms have many different forms, and we'll learn more of those as we progress through grammar. So, 大切な会議があるから、仕事へ行かないとダメです。Because there's an important meeting, it'll be bad if I don't go. And that's the sense of like, I need to do it. And there are several different ways to say should, like shigoto e iku beki desu is literally like the sense of should in the sense of moral obligation. And Japanese communication can be very indirect. So sometimes they won't use a literal word. So you might see other forms like ikanai to dami desu. And modality strength, as you've seen in some of the examples, there's a wide range of very polite, kind of weaker forms to very forceful forms. So if you look at this example, these are all ways to talk about the certainty of whether it's going to snow. So, asate wa yuki ga, starting at the bottom, UI no modality. さては雪が降るかわかりません. Like I don't know at all. They're not certain at all. 降るかもしれません. It might snow. And as we progress up, so 降りそうです, it might snow. 降るでしょ, it's probably going to snow. お降ります, it will snow. If you look at the grammar, most of the words stay the same, and mostly what changes is the conjugation. So it's a little bit different than English modality. That said, Japanese can use completely different forms. So starting on the left-hand side, we have a polite request to not move. So, 動かないでいただけませんか? Would you mind not moving? 動かない方がいい. That's a little bit more direct. You're just kind of suggesting that it would be good not to move. And if you notice, the one above it says, 動かないでください. Even though it might sound politer because you're using please, in some ways it's a more direct request, and therefore it can feel a little stronger. And then there are much coarser and really direct ways of asking things, like 動かな, like something a police officer would say. That's an extremely strong modality. On the right hand, you see the same kind of thing that you saw for snowing. So, 行くかもしれません. Even though that's still might, I might go, even though you're saying might, that expresses someone's intention. So sometimes the words can be Deontic modality about their intentions. Sometimes it can be about the certainty of their factual knowledge. And so something that kind of ties into modality but isn't necessarily modality in and of itself is the cultural significance of shoganai, or the polite version of that, shikataganai. A lot of times, because people feel a strong sense of obligation, you can have negative feelings about really being expected to do a bunch of stuff. And people in Japan often use this idea of shoganai to express their understanding that they're obligated to do something and set those things aside. So your director might say to you, like, 明日までにこの資料を見直すはずだと言いました. He tells you we have to review this materials by tomorrow, and you might say, oh, しょうがないね. お手伝ってもらえませんか? Like, could you help me? And sometimes that shoganai expression, because you're sharing that you understand it's an obligation, you can help soften those hard feelings and bring the group together. So there are lots of other ways to show modality. We've talked about desires. We've talked about intentions. Since they mentioned different forms like causative things, we'll get to those. We also have things like sentence ending particles that can add a lot to modality. So there's a lot to learn. So in conclusion, それはちょっと難しいんですが, there's a story that you may hear in American business partner working with a Japanese business partner, and the American person asked the Japanese worker to do something, and this is what they got in response. And the Japanese business partner was expressing this idea. The American person spoke some Japanese and interpreted that as, you know, it's difficult, but I'll get it done. And the Japanese person was trying to express that it's difficult and I'm not going to do it at all. So yes, it's important to understand the modality and the grammar, but it's also important to understand the cultural meaning. And so Sensei is teaching us the grammar and also the cultural meaning. And hopefully by picking up those nuances, we'll be more fluent speakers. So 日本語はちょっと難しいんですが、一緒に頑張りましょう。